Welcome. In this video, we're discussing Paul's conversion to Christianity. One account of this is found in the book of Acts, and another is found in the book of Galatians. So why do we have two accounts? Well, the early church was divided into two groups. We have the Jerusalem church led by Peter and James, which preached a law-observant gospel, and also a church centered in Antioch led by Paul, which preached a law-free gospel. In our previous video, we explored the Galatians account of Paul's conversion, where Paul really wants to highlight the divide between his gospel and Jerusalem's. So, when I think of Galatians, I think division. But now we come to the book of Acts, where we should think unity. Acts wants to present a history of unity between the apostles in Jerusalem and Paul. As one author writes, quote, Acts is shaped by attempts to promote a view of apostolic harmony, whereby the authority of the Jerusalem church is paired with that of Paul and his mission, end quote. So as we read about Paul's conversion in the book of Acts, it really wants to highlight that Paul's conversion is immediately and fully approved by the church in Jerusalem. Acts is trying to counter the view that Paul was off doing his own thing and that he was separated from the apostles. Acts is trying to convince its audience that Paul was not in any way opposed to the apostles in Jerusalem. Rather, it wants to paint a picture of one big happy family in which there are no disagreements between Paul, Peter, and James. Okay, let's now see all of this in action as we read about Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. And we must start with the martyrdom of Stephen, a pivotal event in early Christianity. Paul himself was present at this event and was pleased with the eradication of the Christians. In Acts chapter 8, we read, quote, That day a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over him, but Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison, end quote. Now, after this, Paul wants to go to Damascus to continue to hunt down Christians. But before going to Damascus, he must first get the approval of the high priest in Jerusalem. As we read in Acts 9, quote, Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem, end quote. Now, starting in Jerusalem, Paul begins on his famous road to Damascus, where he is stopped by a vision of Christ, which renders him blind. As we continue to read in Acts 9, quote, Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He asked, Who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up, enter the city, and you'll be told what you are to do, end quote. From here, Paul continues to Damascus, and there he meets a man called Ananias who restores his sight, and Paul is now a Christian. We are then told, quote, For several days he, Paul, was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues, saying, He is the Son of God. All who heard him were amazed and said, Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem among those who invoked this name? And has he not come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests? Saul became increasingly more powerful and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. After some time had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night so that they might kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket, end quote. So here is the famous scene of Paul in a basket escaping Damascus. And once out of Damascus, Acts will tell us that Paul heads down to Jerusalem. But let's pause here for a moment and really analyze what we're being told by the book of Acts. We are told that Paul spent a few days in Damascus and then went immediately to Jerusalem. This is quite different from what we read in the Galatians account. It agrees that Paul began in Damascus. But remember, Galatians told us that Paul went back and forth from Damascus to Arabia for 3 years, and then eventually made his way down to Jerusalem. Now, is this a contradiction? Well, I don't think it necessarily is, and I agree with Christian apologists like the website gotquestions.org, who rightly point out, quote, the alleged contradiction is resolved simply by recognizing that Luke abridged his version of the narrative using the phrase after many days to cover the whole of Paul's trip to Arabia and his time spent in Damascus. Thus, Luke isn't contradicting Paul, he simply leaves out details he deemed unnecessary to his account, end quote. Now, asking whether something is a contradiction often robs us from asking the truly important question of why. Why does Acts leave out these details? Why does Acts have Paul go immediately to Jerusalem after his conversion and leave out his time in Arabia? The answer to which is by having Paul go immediately to the apostles highlights his unity with the Jerusalem church. Okay, let's now continue to read in Acts 9, starting in verse 26. Quote, when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple, end quote. So Paul tries to meet with the apostles, but they're all afraid. So Barnabas works as a middleman and brings Paul to the apostles, as we read in verse 27, quote, but Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles, and described for them how on the road he had seen the Lord, who had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord, end quote. Now, Acts is portraying Paul's meeting with the apostles as being public. Paul meets with the apostles and Barnabas is involved. Then afterwards, Paul is going in and out from among them and publicly preaching in Jerusalem. This is all public. So let's pause here for a moment and acknowledge Paul's meeting with the apostles is public in the book of Acts. However, in the book of Galatians, Paul only meets privately with Peter and James. Paul says very clearly in the book of Galatians, quote, then after 3 years I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and stayed with him 15 years, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. In what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie, end quote. Now, once again, is this a contradiction? Well, in this instance, I think most likely it is. I can't think of a way of reconciling this, and this contradiction has been noted for centuries. John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople in the 4th century, writes the following about this passage. One may well be at a loss here to understand how it is that, whereas in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul says, I went not to Jerusalem, but into Arabia and to Damascus, and after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter. Here the writer says the contrary. There, Paul says, and none of the apostles saw I, but here it says Barnabas brought him to the apostles, end quote. In defense of Acts, Chrysostom will later on go on to say, quote, for the historian, for conciseness, often omits incidents and condenses the time, end quote. Now, I would disagree with him here. This is not an issue of condensing time or omitting an event. This is the difference between saying a meeting was private or it was public. I can't see a way of reconciling this, but please share your thoughts below in the comment section. I might be missing something here. But once again, do you see how we get sucked up in these issues of contradictions and we lose sight of the more important question of why? Why has Luke told us that the meeting was public and not private like Galatians? The reason is by having Paul be accepted by all the apostles in public highlights his unity with the Jerusalem church. So once again, we see the same motivation come to the surface. Luke is consistently trying to highlight Paul's unity with the Jerusalem church. Let's continue now to read through Acts 9. In verse 28 we read, quote, so he went in and out among them in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He spoke and argued with the Hellenists, but they were attempting to kill him. When the brothers and sisters learnt of it, they brought him to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus, end quote. So fearing persecution, Paul flees to his home in Tarsus. This again contradicts what we read in Galatians. In Galatians, Paul writes in chapter 1, verse 20, quote, in what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ, end quote. Now, how could it be that Paul is unknown to the churches in Judea, but at the same time fleeing Judea due to persecution? I'm not sure how you would reconcile this, but again, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I might be missing something. Let's now quickly summarize the differences between Acts and Galatians. Does Paul spend a few days in Damascus or years in both Damascus and Arabia? Does Paul meet publicly with all the apostles or privately with only Peter and James? Does Paul become well known in Jerusalem or remain unknown? Does Paul flee Jerusalem, fearing persecution, or does he leave inconspicuously? These issues and contradictions can also be visually represented like so. But this video is not about the contradictions between Acts and Galatians. It's all about asking, why do we have these differences at all? What do these differences tell us about the motivation of our authors? Well, Acts wants its audience to know that Paul's gospel is dependent on the church in Jerusalem, while Galatians wants to stress that Paul's gospel is independent of the church in Jerusalem. As we said at the very beginning of this video, Acts is all about unity, while Galatians is about division. Keener, in his massive commentary on Acts, says it the best, and will conclude with this: although Paul and Luke are sincere, the former emphasizes his independence from Jerusalem, and the latter his continuity with it. End quote. If you've learned something new in this video, please hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. These things make a huge difference. These videos comparing Acts and Galatians took a lot of time and research, and if you truly want to support my work and keep this content coming, please consider becoming a patron. My monthly donations through Patreon is truly what keeps this channel alive, and I would have stopped a long time ago if it wasn't for their support. So please consider becoming a patron today, link in the description. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.